The magic of dance is made possible by a grant from S-Mark and Danskin Incorporated in honor of Danskin's 100th anniversary.
Is new in its time. So while we look at some of the dancers considered modern in their day, we'll conjure up Venice in the 16th century, Vienna and Paris in the early 1900s, and America today. But we begin here in the Parthenon, where Isadora Duncan, a young American, came in 1903, and many people call her mother of today's modern dance. She believed that here she would find the source of inspiration of ancient Greek art and bring it back to the world in her dancing. And I think that is exactly what she did do. Isadora was 26 and very beautiful, but I think she was hardly aware of her beauty. She was really quite naive and very serious about her idea of dance. Every day for 4 months, she came and stood here, trying to find that secret of perfection in art, and translate it, as she believed the ancient Greeks had done, into what she called the divine expression of the human spirit. But day after day, she stood absolutely still, because she felt that no movement would be worthy of this place. At length, as she looked at these columns, she suddenly thought, that's the secret. These columns appear absolutely vertical, but they're not. In order to create that illusion, each one is curved and leaning very slightly in. They seem straight and still, but they're in movement. And the movement is stretching up to the sky. And as she thought that, she lifted her arms and she said to herself, that's my dance. She thought, too, the inspiration of Greek art came from nature. She would say, for example, look, how beautiful is the sky. And in that, she found a movement of dance. Or she felt that she was a tree blown by the wind. Everything had to be absolutely natural. Then she went to the museums. She studied the sculptures, the friezes, the movement of the bodies and the drapery of the skirts. One can see how she absorbed the movement of these figures, natural, flowing, and totally opposed to the strict technique of ballet, which she thought was awful. No film was ever made of her dancing, so this inadequate fragment at a garden party in 1927, 2 years before she died, is all there is to show us the real Isadora. To my mind, she wasn't a theatre artist. In terms of theatre, she was really an amateur. Her dancing was better if it was done in a garden or here in the temple. I think that she was like an earth goddess. I think she was Mother Nature. She was most incredibly generous, and all her life her obsession was for children. She was emotional. She was pure emotion. In fact, the whole family were impulsive, and it was very typical of them on their first days in Athens. They suddenly took a decision. Over there, they would build a house on a hilltop and spend the rest of their days leading the simple life of ancient Greece. But the truth is that Isadora was the last person in the world for the simple homespun life. When she discovered love and luxury, she took to them both like a duck to water. The best hotels, the best restaurants, the best champagne, everything. But when she came here, she hadn't yet realized all that. People often say that she was the mother of modern dance, but I think it was just the contrary. Her dance went back to the eternal beauty of classical times, and she was an absolutely unique artist in her own way. But if you wanted to see something modern, there were people like the Wiesenthal sisters in Vienna. They were among the very first of the moderns in Europe, and their style was a revolt against classical ballet technique. Without toe shoes, this was a freer and more expressive way of moving, and really new in 1907. Here, Susan Kirnbauer in Vienna is dancing the original choreography of Greta Wiesenthal's solo to Strauss's Wine, Women and Song. There were three dancing Wiesenthal sisters. Greta was the choreographer of the family, and very good, too. In her dances, she expressed the liberated young woman of her day and the spirit of Art Nouveau, the new style in art which was ultra-modern at the beginning of this century. Like this apartment, high among the rooftops in Vienna, which recaptures the period marvelously. The style affected everything from paintings to furniture, household designs, fashion, and especially architecture, but not music so much, at least not music for dance, because Greta Wiesenthal was happy with old-fashioned Viennese waltzes, and Loie Fuller, who was a real innovator in 1900, danced often to simple popular melodies. She was extraordinarily clever in exploiting the fairly recent discovery of electricity by playing colored lights on yards and yards of swirling skirts. She was an American from Fullersburg, Illinois, and she made this film in 1906 when she was about 44. Today, 80 years after Loie Fuller, one can see a beautiful development of the use of light on yards of fabric in Kam Sin, created by the modern choreographer Robert Cohan for London Contemporary Dance Theatre. Kam Sin is a desert wind that brings strange illusions and desires. All the innovators from the end of the last century on looked for new techniques alternative to ballet, which for 200 years had been the only serious stage dancing. The first step in a new direction, now long forgotten, was skirt dancing, a tremendous rage in England and America in the 1870s when Loie Fuller was growing up. The Paris Opera had always been the center of ballet, but from about the 1880s, the public came to prefer lavish spectacle or the Folie Bergère. Perhaps something like this hand-tinted film made in Paris about 1900 by the French pioneer of cinema, Georges Méliès. That was obviously a cabaret or music hall type of show. But in the world of ballet, too, the most successful productions were very spectacular. Luigi Manzotti created an extraordinary ballet called Excelsior in Milan in 1881. It celebrated new inventions in the theme of man's triumph over ignorance. There were scenes about the first steamship, the Iron Bridge, electricity, telegraphy, the cutting of the Suez Canal, the Festival of Nations, and an apotheosis of light and peace. With a cast of over 500 and leading ballerinas, it was reproduced all over Europe and ran in Paris for a whole year, packing the house. In a way, it was the climax of Italian ballet, bringing together the ultimate in virtuosity and spectacle, but without feeling and expression. But then the Italians were always the masters of spectacle, and almost everything that we know in theatre today originated in Italy, in the palaces of dukes and princes and kings. In the Farnese Palace at Parma in 1617, 250 years before Excelsior, this enormous room was converted to a theatre. It was at a time when performances still normally took place in the center floor of a large hall. So this was a very modern theatre in its day, having one of the first proscenium arches framing a stage at the end of the hall. It opened with a horse ballet, very popular in those days, led by the bridegroom. And there was a court ballet with an enormous cast. There was an opera with people coming down on clouds. And a thrilling scene with sea monsters in real water which flooded the hall to a depth of 3 feet for a battle scene. And it ended with a glorious apotheosis. And all that happened here. And the son of that marriage was so keen on dancing and on theatre that he almost bankrupted the state with the extravagance of the presentations he gave. While the courtiers were enjoying this artificial life, Commedia dell'arte was becoming the simple, popular entertainment of the people. It originated in 1550, based on characters reflecting the foibles and failings of human nature. Piero is the innocent dreamer, Columbine the knowing servant girl. Harlequin, always in a diamond suit, is clever and resourceful. The captain, a braggart and coward. In this scene played in Venice, the captain's horse is accidentally cut in two during a fight with Harlequin, but all turns out well in the end. These characters and more have survived over 400 years, finding their way into every form of entertainment: theatre, circus, pantomime, and of course Punch and Judy. The commedia dell'arte rapidly spread all across Europe, and its link with ballet is very obvious in the use of what we call mime, the art of talking without words. And of course, every Italian knows instinctively how to speak with his hands. In the days of the court entertainments, the Italian dancing masters were way ahead of everybody in the development of steps. I think it's extraordinary that 150 years before this theatre was built, a teacher called Domenico from the little town of Piacenza wrote the first book on court dancing. And he had a pupil known as William the Jew, who spent 30 years preparing a beautifully illustrated book. He liked to insist that the dancers ought to keep time with the music. That was in 1463. But my favorite was Cesare Negri. He was nicknamed the trombone, and he made the courtiers do 10 different kinds of pirouettes, as well as turning out their feet like modern ballet dancers. So it's not surprising that some of the most difficult steps in ballet were invented by the Italians. They always loved virtuosity. But sometimes virtuosity goes too far and there comes a reaction. At the end of the 18th century, it was Salvatore Vigano and Maria Medina, his wife, who briefly brought ancient Greek naturalism into ballet. It's interesting to compare this sketch of Maria with this one of Isadora Duncan little over 100 years later. By that time, in 1903, there was another young American called Ruth St. Dennis, who was simply a graceful high kicker in Broadway shows until the day she caught sight of this cigarette poster. And from that moment on, the mysterious East filled her soul.
At the present time, America is at the beginning of the greatest renaissance of the dance that the world has ever known. What is called the modern or classical dance was begun by two American pioneers, the late Isadora Duncan and myself.
This is the most famous of her dances, the Indian Nautch, a street dancing girl, filmed in 1932. Ruth St. Dennis and her husband Ted Shawn took themselves very seriously in their type of exoticism, which they popularized on lengthy tours, gaining a new respect for the art of dance in America. Not that what they did could be called modern, but they made it fashionable, and they founded a school in California called Dennis Shawn, which attracted serious-minded young students. Notably Martha Graham, an extraordinarily striking and intelligent woman who was to become the true mother of modern dance in our time. In 1926, she took a path of her own to express the complex emotions of a 20th century artist. On stage, she was a star of deep dramatic intensity, and as a choreographer using contemporary music, sculptural scenery, and herself inventing new dance costumes, she is still innovative. Most important of all, she invented a technique of movement and dance, which is already being handed on and establishing its own strong tradition parallel to ballet. Students study one or the other or both techniques. Robert Cohan, who was Martha Graham's principal dancer and partner over a period of 14 years, came to London in 1967 to found the London Contemporary Dance Theatre and School, which is now the major centre for modern dance in Europe. Robert, I wanted to ask you, how would you describe Martha Graham's new approach to movement?
The process that she went into was a very interesting one, because Martha Graham was essentially someone who was trying to communicate through the body, which is what dance should do. And she had to find a new way of moving, because the way of moving up till then was not sufficient for her to say what she had to say. She went into the studio, she tore herself apart creatively, found a new way of moving, and the phenomenal thing is that she was able to come out of the studio, come out of working alone and finding this new source of movement and teaching it. She was able to teach it to other people, and that's what I think was remarkable about what she has done.
The theatre was very important to Martha Graham. She said she regards the word as a verb, not a noun. It is, the dance has to be actively theatrical, is that?
Yes, in our rehearsal periods, we were absolutely directed totally toward the theater. Yeah. We did not do work for the studio. We did work for the theatrical moment. When we came in the theater, it was always a very special process for Martha, and she made it so for all of us in the company. The theater was sacred. It was a place where an essential and very spiritual communion was going to happen between you and the work of art that had been created and the audience.
I was impressed by Martha Graham saying, I wanted to glorify the body in movement and stillness. Do you think that the solo you did in the ballet Come Sin for Patrick Harding-Aylmer, do you think that that shows this modern dance technique?
It's very much a Graham-style solo, yes, because it combines several elements. It combines this enormous flexibility of the spine, which is totally controlled, so that you can move it only so much as you want it in order to say what you want to say, and the enormous physical plasticity and projection. It's what I call an internal solo. He's dancing physically on the stage, but he's dancing what he's feeling internally. And it comes out in both big gestures and very small gestures, and gestures that are made with the entire body, not just the hands or the face.
Ballet has gained a great deal from this new injection of ideas from modern dance.
Yes, it has. And on the other side, we have stopped throwing out the baby with the bathwater. We now have taken what ballet has learned in 300 years and we use it as a part of our technique. And so I think both sides have used the other to advantage now.
But then you can see a classically trained and based ballet company like Harlem Dance Theatre is doing one of the ballets from your London Contemporary Dance Theatre.
Yes, they're doing Troy Games, which is a dance choreographed by Robert North. The idea was a very simple one. We had been on tour in Brazil, and Robert North, we all were enchanted by the Brazilian batucada music, and Robert North especially so. And our men in the company at that time were all very good jumpers. And I said to Robert, why don't you do a dance for the men so that will totally exhaust them, so if they jump from beginning to end. And he put the two ideas together, the batucada music and the men jumping, and he did Troy Game.
In this excerpt, the soloists are Ronald Perry and Lowell Smith. Just about all the contemporary choreography we see today has its roots in America. And no one says much about the early days in Europe, where from roughly 1909 to 1939, the outbreak of the Second World War, The experimental dance artists, most of them individual recitalists or couples, were very active and some of them very serious. There were some who called themselves eccentric dancers, and they were indeed eccentric. The style as a whole was called Central European dancing, and it covered a very wide range, but it was always strongly expressive. One of the few who led a full dance company was the German choreographer Kurt Jooss, and in 1932 he created a ballet called The Green Table, which was powerfully topical of war and the League of Nations discussing peace. The ballet, which has music by Frederick Cohen, opens with the politicians and closes with the same scene. This is the opening of the ballet. Kurt Jooss created the Green Table in 1932, and Martha Graham had begun developing her own technique in 1926. But the extraordinary thing is that the first really modern choreography of this century was done much earlier in 1913 by Václav Nijinsky, and he was a product of the most classical ballet schooling there was, and that was in the Imperial Theatre St. Petersburg. He was a phenomenal dancer, yet even as a dancer he was modern. The ballets in Russia didn't give scope for his talents, and then Serge Diaghilev took a company of dancers from St. Petersburg to Paris in 1909, and he began to plan ballets especially for Nijinsky, and it was those ballets that made his legend. So much so that when Diaghilev cancelled his contract on an emotional impulse, Nijinsky had nowhere to dance because no other company performed those ballets. The idea of Nijinsky out of work today is absolutely unimaginable. Everybody would be fighting to get him. But then it was a real tragedy. He'd begun to choreograph in 1911, and it was 2 years later that he did The Rite of Spring, which was so very much in advance of his time. Nobody before had attempted to match dancing to music like the Stravinsky score, which shocked the public and caused an absolute riot at its first performance in Paris. The original choreography for The Rite of Spring was never written down, and Nijinsky, who was creatively so much in advance of his time, lost his reason only a few years later. So that landmark in modern ballet will always remain an enigma, and Nijinsky's legend is that of the unique and amazing dancer. His daughter Kira was a very young child when his mental illness was developing. Kira, do you remember your father when you were a child before his illness?
Yes, I remember when I was 3 years old. Now, I remember the dress I wore at the Metropolitan Opera House. I was in a box on the right side of the stage. I wore my little green dress, my little muff, my little fur, and I remember the stage was flooded with moonlight, and it came from the right-hand side, and I remember my father moving from the right wing to the left wing in an enormous leap, and his arm was way up like this in the grand jeté. Then I remember my father again in St. Moritz, and there was a terrace, and he would jump on that terrace. And he would pick me up and tell me, point your toes, and down, up and down. My father was to me like a fairy tale. I didn't need a fairy tale book as a child. I had him, all his ballets were my fairy tales. But he became sick when I was 6 years old, and it's a very dramatic thing that I remember. My mother came upstairs. She was afraid of me being around my father, who was acting strange. And there was an argument, and he got very angry, and he gave a kick to my mother and me, and we rolled down the stairs. And another memory comes, there was a little policeman with a little Swiss policeman, a little green uniform with a little green hat, and I knew had come to fetch my father.
That's terrible.
Yeah. It makes me very sad. I feel like crying. Because
Your father
I think he was put into the asylum by my grandparents.
Yes.
My mother gave in. And there is a big question mark. Nobody really knows whether he was really a schizophrenic or whether he became ill when he was in there. I begin to believe that he had schizophrenia. I think so.
Do you feel that you understand how your father felt as a dancer? I think that
I have only felt that, Margot, when I've danced myself. His role, like Spectre de la Rose. But, you see, I've noticed something strange about our family. My father choreographed one way, my aunt choreographed another way, and I choreographed another way. However, what binds us together is a family choreography, and is the circle. That was one of the things my father always loved, everything in the circle.
this thing of the circle and the movement, do you think that your father put all that very circular movement into the Spectre de la Rose, or Fonteyn?
That was Fonteyn.
How was that?
Fonteyn created the liberation at that time in 1909. He created the liberation of the dance from petit pas, because everything was so strict and conventional and beautiful. He would liberate the dance with a movement, for instance, like this, that goes on, transcendental. He would never stay confined within the circle. He would use very harmonious arm movements, very harmonious, the flow of the movement.
Well, don't you think it's rather sad that your father is remembered not for the Rite of Spring, but for the Spectre de la Rose, which is, after all, rather a perfumed ballet?
The perfumed ballet, it is true. It has the magic of the dance, Le Spectre de la Rose, and I think it was the ideal vehicle for my father to express his great love and understanding and wisdom of harmony, the harmony of the universe.
The Spectre de la Rose was first produced in 1911 to Weber's music, choreographed by Fonteyn with scenery by Bakst, on the stage of the Opera House in Monte Carlo, where I dance it with Mikhail Baryshnikov. The story is based on these lines from a poem: "I am the spirit of a rose you wore to the dance." There seems an irony in the fact that Nijinsky, who did create the first really modern ballet, is known better for his dancing in ballets like Spectre de la Rose, while Isadora Duncan, who recreated antiquity, is so often called the mother of modern dance. But it's all evolving continually, everything taking inspiration from something that's gone before. So when we ask, what is new? In a way, it's nothing and everything.
The magic of dance is made possible by a grant from S-Mark and Danskin Incorporated in honor of Danskin's 100th anniversary.
Mystery presents Father Brown, G.K.